result, on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. Observation 1. The Council on Foreign Relations finds that economic sanctions can not only be on countries, but also on specific groups or individuals. Observation 2. The Oxford Dictionary defines threat as the possibility of danger or ruin. Therefore, we prove to you the capability of Russia goes down as a result of sanctions. You vote pro. Observation 3. To examine whether sanctions reduce the threat Russia poses to the West, we must compare Russian aggression in the world with and without sanctions. Contention 1. Alternatives are worse. In a world without sanctions, there will be two possible alternative actions the West could take. Peter Fever, the Brookings Institute, explains that both options would increase the Russian threat. 1. A diplomatic warning would signal irresolution and encourage Russia to engage in a more aggressive activity in eastern Ukraine. And 2, the use of military force or providing military assistance would only escalate the conflict in Ukraine. In contrast, the Polish Institute of International Affairs writes that sanctions have so far been the most effective instrument of Western influence on Russia's policy towards Ukraine, stopping the Kremlin from making a greater military incursion. Contention 2, Ukraine. Subpoint A, the economic capacity. Michael Guria from the New Economic School of Moscow reports that Putin's high military spending, despite the weakening economy, means that all of his reserves will be depleted by the end of the year. Due to sanctions, Russia can't take out foreign loans, so they will literally run out of money. Guria furthers that Russia has 2 years, but will have to cut military spending completely. The effect on policy is clear. Catherine Hill of Financial Times explains that Russia's most recent budget report reveals that the government is planning to cut military spending by 5.3% in 2016 due to sanctions, meaning a less capable Russian military. Subpoint B, deterring future action. Sanctions limit further Russian aggression. Iona Petrescu of the University of Maryland corroborates that sanctioned countries are 8% less likely to engage in further military disputes because they try to avoid the cost of sanctions. Essentially, Putin will now think twice before invading another nation, since he knows that a fresh round of sanctions will further cripple his country. Therefore, Ayana Dreyer of the EU Institute for Security Studies finds the economic consequences of sanctions have prevented Russia from seizing more territory. For example, the city of Mariupol was not taken even though it easily could have been. In other words, the ramification of sanctions on Russia prevented from openly destabilizing other parts of Ukraine. Contention 3, sanctioning terrorists. Armin Rosen, a Business Insider, finds that Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons that are spread all over with extremely low security. Rosen continues that loose nukes in Russia will be the greatest crisis of the next decade. In 2015, Christopher Harris reported that ISIS attempted to steal nuclear material from Russia and was extremely close, but was thwarted by the US. Economic sanctions specifically against terrorists have been successful in prohibiting them from gaining access to weapons. Alice Bezo of the International Institute for Sustainable Development reports that after 9/11, President Bush placed economic sanctions on 27 terrorist organizations and individuals. Since then, the US government has reported that economic sanctions on over 1,000 terrorists have completely frozen their assets, prohibiting them from spending money on illicit activities. George A. Lopez of the Center for Strategic and International Studies finds that U.S. efforts to sanction terrorist groups, rogue state leaders, and non-state actors have been successful for the past decade. Captain Patrick Buckley of West Point explained that freezing terrorist assets has two effects. First, decreasing terrorist resources and disrupting
oil and gas in rubles and not dollars. The result is economic recession throughout the West. The Journal of Public Affairs in 2014 finds that if the dollar and euro ceases to be the world's reserve currencies, the West would be unable to fund its debt, and inflation would spike to 80 to 90%, putting Western economies in the red. Contention 2 is cyber warfare. Leon Panetta, former Defense Secretary of the United States, contends that Russia is unable to counter sanctions in traditional economic ways, that their way of retaliation is surely through cyber means. CrowdStrike, a U.S. cybersecurity firm, provides an empirical quantification, finding that Russian cyber attacks against the West have increased from about 12 before sanctions to more than 10,000 after. Furthermore, a study by the Ponemon Institute asserts there has been an 18% increase in successful Russian cyber attacks after sanctions were implemented. Russian cyber warfare produces two threats to Western interest. First, crippling the economy. Matthew Owens of Newsweek finds that Russian hackers have stolen $900 million from Western banks, and $300 billion have been stolen and lost by U.S. corporations. In addition, a McAfee study notes that cybercrime could cost as many as 200,000 U.S. jobs. Second is crippling infrastructure. The Huffington Post reports that Russian hackers successfully shut down the Pentagon for 2 weeks in June. Unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg. James Clapper, Obama's top intelligence official, warns that threats have been increasing in frequency, scale, sophistication, and severity. This is validated by an incident last week as Reuters explains that Russian hackers were able to shut down a third of Ukraine's power grid. If that wasn't bad enough, a 2014 analysis by Black & Veatch revealed that only 32% of United States electrical companies have systems in place to stop a cyber attack, thus making the rest of the grid vulnerable for an attack. This is the biggest impact of today's round for 2 reasons. First, on severity. Joe Weiss of CNN explains that a successful attack on a U.S. power grid could shut down power for months. Second, on magnitude. A July report by the University of Cambridge explains that an attack on an electrical grid could yield up to $1 trillion worth of damage. Contention 3 is Russian aggression. Sanctions strengthen Putin domestically in 2 ways. First, reinforcing authoritarianism. Michael Burnham of the Washington Post explains that Russia's economic problems would have erupted with or without sanctions. That's important because Barry X of the Brookings Institute explains that sanctions will provide an excuse for a worsening economy even though sanctions weren't the cause. The Levada Center then contends that after economic sanctions, 80% of Russians view the United States as negative. Thus, Putin has the power to act aggressively throughout much of the world. Second is anti-NATO sentiment. Just last week, the Washington Times reported that Vladimir Putin signed a new defense strategy that declares NATO as a threat to Russia's national security. The impact is an increase in overall aggression. David Levitiskin of the University of New Orleans, in a 50-year peer-reviewed analysis of 211 sanctions, finds that economic sanctions, when implemented by the West, increases the probability of militarized conflict by 195%. This is empirically validated throughout much of the world. Firstly, in Ukraine, the New York Times reported on Christmas Eve that Russia has mobilized 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine in preparation for full-out conflict. Secondly, in the Arctic, Gary Ruffhead of the Wall Street Journal stated in August of 2015 that Russia has added 6,000 soldiers permanent military force to the region. Thirdly, in Syria, Russian attacks have displaced 100,000 Syrians. That's critical because NYU finds that a 1% increase in the refugee population leads to an increase in transnational terrorism by 18%. And finally, in the South China Sea, Christopher Harass of the International Business Times reported in 2015 that Russia and China conducted naval drills that were the largest in the history of cooperation between the 2 nations. And for those reasons, we negate today's resolution.
So you talk about in contention 3, there's an increases public support, right?
In contention 3, yeah.
Okay, so what does that do?
So essentially what we're saying is that after economic sanctions were implemented, and according to Burnham, what he finds is that regardless of whether or not sanctions caused the recession inside of Russia, what happens then is that Putin uses the justification for economic downturn because of sanctions, and so because of that, he increases his
I understand that there's increased public support. I'm asking what's the impact of it.
Oh, okay. So essentially, since Putin's people support him, he's able to consolidate his regime, and because of that, they support. What that does is it allows him to go inside of Ukraine, use the 100,000 troops on the border,
awesome.
go inside of the Arctic.
Ukraine. So what was Putin's support when he annexed Crimea?
What do you mean by Putin's support?
Like, was it lower or higher than it is now?
It increases what we're saying.
Okay, right. So it was low before he annexed Crimea, right? But he still invaded Ukraine. Like, even without public support, he still invaded Ukraine, right?
Okay, but what we're saying then, then what we're saying then is that since the public is supporting his action, it just greater incentivizes him to continue to act.
So what's happened after we engage in sanctions and public support increase?
Okay, what happened after engaging
like, how
in
much
sanctions
territory,
is an increase in military intervention.
How much territory have they gained in Ukraine?
Okay, they're putting 100,000 troops on the border right now. They're
okay,
still inside of Ukraine conflict zone. They're inside of the Arctic with 6,000 troops. Now, may I have a question?
Wait, first,
you've asked a few questions.
How can there be 100,000 on the border and 50,000 are in Ukraine?
It's scheduling inside of 2016 to
okay, so it hasn't happened.
Right now he's mobilized 100,000 and now they're on the border. Okay. So, according to your, essentially, the consequences stop seizing more territory, right, is what you say in your sub-point B in your second contention.
Yeah.
But how is that true if in the status quo we're seeing empirical aggression?
Okay, recognize that as I just explained, they haven't taken any more territory, and you
okay,
yourself—
just because they haven't taken more territory doesn't mean they pose more of a threat when they've displaced 100,000 Syrians, okay?
Whoa, okay, let's talk about
sure.
Syria.
Yeah.
What does Syria have to do with sanctions?
Okay, so essentially what Vladimir Putin is now doing is he's trying to gain leverage because of economic sanctions by going into Syria.
When did Putin start engaging in Syria? When did his cooperation with Assad begin? Like, when did they become allies? Pre-sanctions, right?
Sure, pre-sanctions,
okay,
but we're telling you that after sanctions, military intervention increases.
But that has nothing to do with
I totally agree with the fact that I totally agree for the fact that
if
for
you
4
can answer,
decades,
if you can answer one question, I'll concede this. what evidence proves causation? Because all you're saying
Okay,
that
I'm
after
trying to
sanctions
answer the question and you're not allowing me to answer
Okay,
it,
prove
okay?
causation.
I'm telling you that for 4 decades, Vladimir Putin has been friends with the Assad regime. But what happens after sanctions is that he compounds his military support, according to the New York Times, essentially, because what happens is he's trying to gain leverage inside of these negotiation deals to lessen sanctions. So he's getting a leg up over the United States by supporting the Assad regime, which they clearly don't want.
Opponents say that Russian aggression should be the most important thing. We're going to topic this on balance, therefore you're not going to look at just Russian aggression, but other things to talk about, such as nuclear security. Let's go into our opponent's first contention for this geopolitical threat, and there's de-dollarization. We have 4 responses. First, put simply, removing the dollar as a reserve currency of not only the world, but even any singular economy is impossible. Roger Quinn of UC Berkeley explains that de-dollarization is an irreversible decision because pegging the exchange rate with the currency board keeps the option to vote alive. In other words, with the dollar, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, because exchange rates will just adjust to whatever your desired currency is. You can't get away from the dollar. Second, Andrew Kramer of the New York Times explains that Russia and China have been divesting from the dollar in 2010. Sanctions were put in place in 2014. This is important for 2 reasons. First, Russia divesting from the dollar has nothing to do with sanctions. But second, if this was so harmful, we would have seen a huge negative impact in 2010, making show you the real world impact that this actually happened. Third, William Wilson of the Heritage Foundation was that to become a world reserve currency, the host economy must have a totally liberalized financial system, because sound rule of law assures investors that they are safe from asset expropriation. That's key, because Wilson then notes expropriation has been employed in Russia in only recent years, which is essentially a one-party state, and China's one-party state will remain an obstacle in the same way. Thus, neither China nor Russia can host the world reserve currency, because neither have sufficiently liberal economic platforms. Fourth, Matt Yellis of Fox News, who said it would take some equivalent of world wars to erode the United States from its current position as the world reserve currency, in the same way it took the World War I for the US dollar to replace the British pound. Unless that puts our impact into World War III, this isn't happening. Let's go into our opponent's second condition about cyber warfare. We have a couple responses. First, Ian Trainer, the increase in Russian cyber attacks is not related to sanctions. Ian Trainer with The Guardian claims that Russia had been pursuing policy of cyber attacks long before Western sanctions in 2007. The same year says this thing continued in 2009-2011, and the Chicago Tribune says this again went up in 2013. They never tell you basically because of sanctions, this increase, there's been an overall increase in trend. Second, minimize the impacts. Cyber attacks was a very small threat to Western interests. Courtney QB of NBC says that so far, Russian cyber attacks have not seized or compromised any classified information, only unclassified accounts have been hacked. And so far this year, you're not going to look at impacts. But third, Joshua Keating of Slate says that Russia has instigated basically 1.7% of all cyber attacks, further minimizing the combined opponent's impacts. So what you see here that Russian cyber attacks don't make it even a huge part of this. But moreover, it's a maybe couple this one piece of evidence. First about the 900 million. First of all, this says it's not necessarily from Russian hackers, it could be from anyone. But second, 300 billion the release says overall in the United States there was $300 billion cost of hacking. It's not specific to Russia at all. And next, they talked about how 12 attacks increased to 10,000. This is from Stratfor, a cybersecurity firm. They have an incentive to lie and increase the number of cyber attacks because they have no people looking at over them. Let's go into our opponent's third contention about Russian aggression. We have a couple of responses. First, the social elites, they talk about how like 80% of Russians are going to agree with this. We have a couple of responses. First, Amanda Taub of Fordham reports that Putin regime is prompted by social elites and his rules nothing to do with popular opinion. This means that no impact to increasing popular support for Putin matters. His policies are directed by a small group of people. And so far that Putin could already invade Ukraine with the amount of popularity he had before, what can he do now more? They never tell you. Now, especially they talk about how like anti-NATO and all these other things, and they talk about Russian aggression is increasing. We have a couple of responses. First, sanctions further deter further conflict. Ayanna Dreyer of the European Union Security Studies finds that sanctions have deterred Russia from seizing even bigger chunks of territory. They could have easily seized Mariupol, Odessa, or Transnistria, but they haven't. Second, sanctions provide a real chance for diplomacy. Simon Galbert of CSIS says that there's a real chance of diplomatic resolution to the conflict with sanctions than without them. Third, Michael Gurry from the New Economic School of Moscow says that Russia let the pull out of Ukraine in 2 years because they're running out of money. Fourth, reducing tensions would empower Putin. Kerry Giles of the Royal Institute for International Affairs meant that reducing or eliminating sanctions would send the clear message that the West is giving up. This would lead to Putin getting away with more territory grabs with no consequences. Lastly, according to Village News 2015, the number of civilian casualties dropped in the last 3 months compared to the 3 months before. And so far this year, seeing the overall aggression in Russia is decreasing. For all these reasons, we urge a pro-battle.
For our framework in today's round, because you look to the fact that the economic sanctions were imposed by the West directly because of the fact that Russia annexed Crimea. That's really important because if we prove to you that economic sanctions deter further Russian aggression, that's going to be important and that's going to be reducing the threat that Russia poses to Western interests. With that being said, let's go to my opponent's observations. Firstly, they give you this definition of threat. We can see that. But then thirdly, they give you this idea of like you have to compare a world with economic sanctions and a world without. Recognize that that is not resolutional. Recognize that the resolution only asks us to analyze whether or not economic economic sanctions decrease the threat that Russia poses to Western interests. They can not link out of this because even if there's a more effective method, then that's not what the resolution is actually asking us to do. So with that being said, you can drop their first contention from the float right here. But let's go to their first contention, and let's have a couple more responses. Firstly, you recognize that this is completely possible to know in a world without economic sanctions. The best we can do is to assess current impacts rather than these what-if questions that my opponents are talking about. But even if you don't believe my last response and you still believe this argument on balance, you recognize that military intervention or whatever they're advocating for is more successful than economic sanctions. There have been 2 empirical warrants that give you a comparative analysis. Firstly, you look at Gary Hupper, the Washington economic. That's like me saying that a bank has money, right? So if I steal money from the bank, that's the bank's threat.
Yes.
That literally makes zero sense.
Here's the better analogy. Say there's a bank in Syria, for example, which has money open out everywhere. If then the Assad goes and takes all the money, that's a very bad thing. Which is the same thing here. Russia's holding out these weapons that are very vulnerable, and people are going to take these weapons.
And so that's your link back to the Russian threat.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the probability of this happening? What's the probability of a nuclear terrorist attack?
I'm telling you, they're very vulnerable. There was an attempt in 2015.
Okay, well, my partner is going to read you a card in the next speech to essentially explain that the probability of a nuclear terrorist attack
One in
is
35 billion,
Yeah,
right?
3.5 billion.
Yeah, 3.5. Okay, cool.
So how do you
what
evaluate
you see
an
here? This
impact?
is first of all, this is predated. It's before our evidence. So it's not talking about when.
So why would you don't give me comparative analysis that says accurate economic sanctions? Now all of a sudden the probability of a nuclear terrorist attack increases.
At Russia and talk about that. Or
No.
saying in general.
In general,
And what's
and
the
it looks
methodology
around
behind
the
the study?
world.
What's the methodology behind the study?
Well, I mean, it looked to the fact that literally terrorists don't have any access to ever go into a nuclear power
Back then when it was conducted, they had no access. But now with Russia loose nuclear weapons, they do have access. The only thing preventing that is the United States. That's something really key. Do you have a question for me?
Yes, so let's talk about your responses to my second contention, right?
Mhm.
You basically just explain, right, from the you say that Stratford will lie, right? Is that your analysis, right? Why
They
would
have an
Stratford
incentive-
lie?
they have an incentive
What,
to
what
lie.
incentive?
They are a cybersecurity firm. If they state there are more cyber attacks, they're going to get more business. Therefore, they have an incentive
Wait.
to lie. There's no overhead because no one.
Okay, it was cited on 3 news sources that literally peer
all
reviewed
those
the
all those news
report.
sources cited Stratford.
No, yeah, but it was CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity firm.
So who looks over Stratford stats and confirms them?
No,
No
it was CrowdStrike, which is oversighted by
CrowdStrike.
Google, that literally found is that after economic sanctions,
So
retaliatory
who
cyber
monitored the
attacks.
study? Who monitored it? Was it peer reviewed?
I
Anything
didn't-
like that?
I don't think it was peer reviewed.
It's
but,
your piece of evidence. Okay, so
but
it's
even
not
if you
peer
don't believe that,
reviewed.
right?
A
We
cybersecurity
still
identified
okay.
by itself. They have the incentive. I clearly have incentive to increase the number of cyber
Right,
attacks. So
but then
don't know
we
how
give you
much
another
evidence.
piece of analysis that tells you that there's
Well,
an
that piece of
18%
analysis.
increase in successful attacks between 2014 and 2015.
First of all, I'm not supposed to be Russian at all.
Okay, so then you talk about basically that they haven't taken classified information.
Yeah.
When was that published?
I can give it to you later.
Yeah,
I'm
because
not
we
sure.
tell you last week, Russia hackers were able to shut down the third of Ukrainian power grid, leaving 2 million people without power.
Okay, so okay.
Quickly on my opponent's arguments. On the first argument, remember what Siraj tells you, de-dollarization started in 2010. That's way before sanctions enacted. That first write-off, that's non-unique. But second, remember it's been going on for so long. You see none of their impacts. Right there, you drop that argument. Second, on cyber warfare, the piece of evidence that they give us in today's round, you can call for it after. It's saying that Ukraine lost its power grid after the rest of Ukraine stopped shipping supplies to that sector of the region. Has literally nothing to do with cyber warfare. Call for that card. Now, third on Russia and China and increased public support, decreased anti-NATO. Recognize what Siraj tells you that according to Dreyer, which they don't really respond to, that when you have economic sanctions, there's an 8% less probability of a further military dispute. They're saying that our evidence is talking about large countries. They slyly they don't read the next 4 words, which is or a large a large coalition of countries, which is EU, West, Canada, Australia. Right there, on that piece of evidence, you can straight up drop this contention. Let's look at our arguments. First, on alternatives, we tell you that when you compare whether it's reducing the threat or not, you have to look at a world with and or without sanctions. That's why we show you that in a world without sanctions, it's much, much worse, because either 1, we would do nothing and nothing would check back Russia, or 2, we would intervene and that would only escalate conflict. They try to tell you that you only look at military aggression. Recognize that sanctions were put in place in Crimea, sure. But that doesn't mean that that's the only threat that Russia poses to Western interests. Now let's look at our main argument, which is why you're going to be voting for us, which is the sanction terrorists. They're saying it's non-topical because they fundamentally misunderstand our argument. What we're trying to tell you is that when you sanction terrorists, you basically cut off all their funds, and that decreases all their operational capabilities. That's why I give you the example from last year, how the US specifically stopped Russia from getting news. Lastly, on Ukraine, we tell you that they're decreasing their military capability in the long term, and after 2 years, they'll have to pull out of Ukraine. My opponents never respond to this. All they're saying they're increasing military spending. We agree with that. In the long term, they have to pull out.
military aggression due to the fact that the reason why sanctions were implemented in the first place was to deter Russia's military aggression. We can also evaluate other impacts, but this one's the most important one because that's the purpose of sanctions. With that going forth, let's go to their first contention where they talk about alternative methods and solutions. One, we tell you it's not topical due to the fact that the resolution asks us to evaluate one solution, not whether or not it be the best solution. Now, not only that, but we show you comparative analysis that finds military intervention is far more effective than economic sanctions, proving that they don't even win that argument. To go further, let's talk about Ukraine. We show you the most recent piece of evidence with the 100,000 troops on the border inside of Ukraine on Christmas Eve. Not only that, but they provide you only predictive evidence that is before ours. We provide you the most recent one, and because this resolution is in the present tense, prefer us. We're winning on Ukraine. Not only that, but we go further and talk about their declaration and how nations essentially are 8% less likely to engage in military disputes when economic sanctions are in place. One, we tell you, my partner offered an explanation why this isn't applicable to Russia. And two, even if you don't buy that, the empirics don't validate it. We show you in the Arctic 6,000 military troops after economic sanctions. We show you 100,000 in Ukraine, and we also show you 100,000 Syrians are displaced because of Russian airstrikes inside of Syria and attempt to get leverage over the United States and get rid of sanctions. Clearly, it's only making Russia more aggressive. Now onto our side of the foe. We show you one with cyber warfare. They respond saying that we had this policy before, but we provide you with comparative analysis. 12 cyber attacks before to 10,000 after. Clearly, that's a huge increase. We also show you that they're growing in sophistication, that they're responsible for a third of all malware, which they never respond to. That means we access the impacts. We access the $300 million stolen from Western banks, the $900 billion stolen from U.S. corporations, and the 200,000 jobs lost. This is present tense impacts. This is happening in the status quo. They don't ever negate the impacts. We're winning on cyber warfare. Finally, on to the contention of Russian aggression. They tell you that essentially that there's been a decrease in casualties, but we're showing you overall that there's an increase in aggression, that is not stopping Russia, and that they've displaced 100,000 Syrians, which leads to an increase in terrorism. According to NYU, 1% in refugee population leads to an 18% increase in terrorism. That means you can turn their third contention about terrorism onto our side.
Yeah. Would you like the first question?
Oh, yeah. So what's worse, cyber attacks or ISIS getting nuclear weapons?
I would say that you evaluate the magnitude or like the prevalence of an impact by probability times magnitude, right?
Okay, sure.
So, insofar, right, as your magnitude, what's the magnitude of ISIS getting a cyber attack, right? What is it?
Nuclear war.
What, like nuclear? Okay, so they shoot off a weapon. How many people that kill?
I'm talking specifically.
Yeah, let's say how
ISIS
many.
were to gain nuclear weapons, said the terrorist plan killing several hundred million people.
700. Okay, let's say that is true.
Okay.
Okay. Then you multiply that by the probability that actually happens by 1 in 3.5 billion.
No, okay, so
you still do that, and that's still less than like that still holistically isn't as much as we tell you that the money is being lost in the status quo.
So let's talk about like, your evidence about that, right? So like when you said there was a cyber attack last week, how much did that cost? Or what was the impact of that?
Well, we tell you that after sanctions and because of the cyber attacks, there was a loss of $900 million.
$900 million? It says like Russia at the very top of the article, and at the bottom, it's not talking Russia at all. It's just like
yes,
in
it
general,
is. Russian
they're
hackers
not
stole $900 million.
You
can call for it.
Like call for all their cyber aggression, or say
Go
they
ahead.
don't talk about
And
it.
like, wait, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So on your third contention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do sanctions, like, you basically talked about freezing assets, right?
Yeah, right.
So like, or like travel bans too, right? So like, how's it a travel ban? How's it going to stop like a terrorist from like attacking something if they have the incentive to do so?
It's mainly freezing their assets. Recognize that like major organizations to pull up coordinated operations, for example, stealing or selling nuclear weapons. It takes a lot of synchronization and a lot of sophistication. So to do this, they need to move around their funds and be able to openly access them. Freezing their assets prevents this from happening, which mitigates their
why does that
how
make
do they-
Russia a threat then?
Yeah.
Like, what's
Russia's
the
enabling
link?
these terrorists, but moreover,
Wait, say that one more time.
Why don't they
please.
get it from
Russia
like
is
a
enabling these terrorists by having vulnerable nuclear weapons. So therefore, Russia poses a massive threat.
So is
Wait.
Russia giving them these weapons, or are
They're
they
being
stealing them
stolen
from
from
Russia?
Like for example,
Which one is it? Can you answer that question?
They're being stolen
is
from
Russia
Russia.
giving? So they're being
Right. So
stolen.
if
Yes,
somebody
yeah.
steals, say I have like lunch money, right? And some kid steals my lunch money, right?
Sure.
Is that like my fault?
I mean, if you hold it out of your pocket and say, "Hey, come here, bully," then sure, it's your fault.
So is Russia saying?
So
that?
Russia's saying, "Here, come here,
By
terrorist,
having
steal our
really
nuclear
vulnerable
technology."
nuclear-
They're not
They're
securing their nuclear weapons, and at that point, it is their fault.
And so it's their threat, though. Even if it's their
it
fault,
is
you don't prove
okay,
it's a
so
threat.
your lunch money analogy doesn't matter because money itself isn't a threat, but nuclear weapons themselves are a threat.
Like remember what we said specifically, like in February of last year, that ISIS was very close to acquiring nuclear weapons. But the only thing that stopped it was U.S. sanctions on these
So
terrorists.
has
The FBI had to
a
go in and
nuclear
prevent
terrorist
this.
attack occurred in the
The
status quo?
no.
Has
the
it occurred in
reason-
the last decade?
No, the reason why is because last year the FBI went in and seized the weapons from ISIS.
So
it's
status
not
quo
even-
solves.
yeah,
Last
so
year,
it's not a
economic sanctions were
problem.
imposed. If
Yes.
Western nations are solving the problem, then that obviously.
So we
includes
show you
access
that
to your
because of
facts.
economic sanctions, the FBI went in and prevented ISIS from getting nuclear weapons.
What-
There-
Western
wait,
nations
Why
are
did
solving the
economic
problem.
sanctions make the FBI
Yeah,
go
like,
asset
wouldn't the
freezing-
FBI have an
asset
incentive without
freezing-
economic sanctions to go in and take these nuclear weapons?
Can I answer? So my opponents say that at the beginning there last summer that Russia is the most important thing in this Ukraine conflict. Like we agree it's the most important thing, but the second most important thing is the nuclear weapons. So first on to Russia. Remember they dropped the Patriot Guard continuum. We tell you that 8% reduction in these Russian future going this reducing Russia by 8% as a result of this. Right there, they never responded to that. We give them evidence 3 times, they never respond to it. The second one they don't respond to the Belarus news card, which Ramon extends the summary, which means the most important part for winning this round. So that the number of civilian casualties dropped more than 3 times in September to November against 3 number ones before. So what's like right here is they don't respond to saying that overall, even if there's more troops as our opponents say, that overall the conflict is decreasing, the number of deaths are decreasing. At that point, you can vote for the part there because we are decreasing the threat. Now, the second main voting issue is talking about nuclear security. They do very lax work on this because they don't understand the contention. The fact of the matter here, they say, oh, it's the threat of these terrorists. But by having Russia have these vulnerable and loose nukes, they're enabling these terrorists. What we tell you specifically is that the U.S. has placed for asset raising on these terrorists, and as a result, they can't get access to these nuclear weapons. And even when ISIS was really close to it last year, the FBI went in and prevented that. They stopped the deal as it was happening. And the impact of this is really huge. Remember what we specifically tell you in Moss says that in his last summary, saying that the ISIS group plans to use nuclear weapons to launch a global assault on anyone who holds against their religious beliefs. It says specifically that a journalist who was held there says that the terrorists plan on killing several hundred million people. Right there, I would every single one of that's because all their cybersecurity talks about money and stuff like that, but you prefer lives over this money because they don't actually talk about how that harms people's lives by just money, by having economic harm. And economic in of itself isn't a bad thing. Now they talk about a lot in this debate about how like cyber warfare and how it's very successful. But the fact of the matter is that one, they can't actually give you specific examples, citing specifically Russia, saying how that actually happened. The second one, if you call for all the cards that around the 19 million, 3 billion, and the 10,000 card, all these aren't talking about Russia. All they say that overall there were hackers who did it, or overall there were some attackers who did it, and it might have been around that money. It's never definitive. So what we show you on the pro is that there has been a definitive threat by stopping this nuclear attack happening, but on the con there is no definitive threat. For all these reasons, we're pro balance.
ISIS is going to steal like nuclear weapons from Russia. Recognize this argument is completely non-topical, right? If I hold up my wallet, somebody steals my wallet, right? Recognize that's not the threat I pose, that's the threat that one of you guys has posed, right? At the end of the day, you recognize it's a threat garnered from terrorists. It's not the threat garnered from Russia. But if you're looking into terrorism, we tell you we outweigh on this argument because they completely drop this analysis. We tell you that Russia went into Syria because of economic sanctions. As a result of that, they displaced 100,000 Syrian refugees. Then we read the ET analysis in every single speech that explains that a 1% increase in a country's refugee population increases transnational terrorism by 18%. We link it back into probability. It's happening right now in the status quo. You preferred on that. But even if you don't believe that and you believe the impact to their argument, recognize that it literally has 0 probability. We read you the Huff-Bear analysis from Ohio State University that tells you that literally in 1 in 3.5 billion probability, or 3.5 billion that this would actually happen, you drop them on face. On our side of the flow, we give you 2 reasons to vote for us. The first has to do with the idea of cyber warfare, right? They basically respond with the idea, right, that all the evidence isn't specific. Yes, it is. We tell you, Liam Panetta says that the natural reaction to Russian economic sanctions is cyber attacks. And then we empirically quantify that via comparative analysis. Before and after economic sanctions, there's an increase in Russian cyber attacks specifically from 12 to 10,000. But then we go in the impacts themselves. These aren't hypothetical. These are manifesting in the status quo today. We tell you that Russian hackers stole $900 million from banks, $300 billion from corporations, and in addition to that, it cost 200,000 American jobs. That is the biggest threat in today's round, and it outweighs anything that they talk about in their third contention, because if anything, it's 100% probable because it's happening right now in the status quo. Then in our third contention, you're going to extend through the 195% decrease or increase in aggression because of economic sanctions. This is a better study than their 8% analysis, so you extend it across the flow. But then we don't just stop there. We tell you in Ukraine, Russia is mobilizing the status quo, 100,000 troops on the ground. They've labeled NATO as a threat to their national security. They're preparing for war. 6,000 troops in the Arctic was completely non-responsive. And then obviously the Syrian analysis is going to seal the deal. And it's for that reason I strongly urge a negative ballot.